happy to have this discussion. And so we will be discussing this event. This event is recorded and it is going streaming live on our MDRC's Michigan Disability Rights Coalition Facebook page. And so, so we are just really excited to have this discussion. So today, I have Monica Wiley here with me.
This meeting is being recorded.
And also, I'm happy to have Amalea here with us as well from the NAACP Leadership Defense Fund. So it's going to be a great discussion. Feel free to comment in the chat here on Zoom, or if you're watching us on our Facebook, you can leave your comments and also, your questions there. We will have time to ask questions. So let's get this started. Welcome, Monica and Amelia. Yes. So before we get the discussion started, Monica, if you could share a little bit of your background with us.
Sure. Thank you so much, Tameka, and to all of the attendees here. And I am just truly delighted to be sharing the stage with Miss Amelia. And Miss Amelia, please charge it to my head and not my heart. It is not my intention to mispronounce your name. I tried to practice a couple of seconds ago, so please forgive me, but I'm truly delighted to be serving with you on this panel. And good afternoon, everyone. I am Monica Wiley. In my official capacity, I am the voter engagement specialist at NDRN. In my unofficial capacity, I continue to do voter engagement as a strategist and DEIA training, as I'm a practitioner who has been doing this for the past several years. Just to give you an image description, which I love to do, I am a Black woman, African-American woman with some lovely multicolored glasses and some nice, lovely golden blonde, mixture of blonde locks that is just flowing on the side of my face to complement the multicolored in my glasses. I have on a black shirt and then just some lovely nails that are purple lavender with a little bit of bedazzle. So that is the look for today, and just some light lipstick. I wanted to do the red, but I was like, what, maybe let's not do the red today. That may be being a bit much because I can be a bit much. That's pretty much my background. I used to work with the Democratic Party and the DNC. I come from the state level and the national level on voting rights and voter engagement. One of my biggest, I would say, accomplishments is I was one of the architects responsible for curbside voting in Virginia when I lived in Virginia. When I worked at the time for former Governor Terry McAuliffe there in Virginia. I am now in the great state of Maryland, or sometimes I like to say Maryland. I'm going to get a clap for that with the lovely Governor Wes Moore. And I have introduced curbside voting a couple of times here in Maryland. Now they've given me a little bit of a hard time, but I'm such a relentless pit bull in the skirt, if you will. And so I'm not going to let that deter me from getting this done. And it is very important to our community to have greater access to the ballot. And to me, I feel like that's all I can say. I don't want to continue to go on and on and on because I definitely want to get into the presentation and then look forward to some of the interaction from the attendees. And with that being said, I yield back to you.
Yes. Thank you. And Amalea. Yes, share a little bit of your background.
Yeah, and it's all good. I accept all pronunciations of my name. So hi, everyone. My name is Amalea Smirniotopoulos. I use she, her pronouns. I am a white woman with sort of chin-length, dark curly hair, wearing a blue blazer and a red shirt, which really pops against my official LDF background, which is also blue. Very excited to be here with you today. So I have two hats at LDF, both of which are relevant to this conversation. I'm a senior policy counsel working on economic justice issues broadly, which includes our work on fair housing, employment discrimination, anti-poverty programs, fair lending, all of the mechanisms that help create economic opportunity in this country. And I also co-manage a project called the Equal Protection Initiative, which brings together not just our policy work, but also our litigation, our communications, organizing, and other tools to really try to confront the attacks we're seeing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in this country right now, whether that's showing up in your ability to get a job or, get promoted and thrive where you're working, in the schools that you're attending, in your access to housing, and in other sectors. And just really happy to be here with you all today.
Yes, thank you. And I need to do my physical visual description. So I am a African American woman, brown skin, wearing long hair, is black at the roots and red going down. And then wearing a sweater is red, brown, and black. And I am the director of leading programs here at Michigan Disability Rights Coalition. So yes. So let's get this conversation started. So let's begin with some context. And both of you can, answer this question. So what is the historical relationship between the disability rights movement, civil rights movement, and the broader DEIA framework that we know of now? And so what's the historical relationship, and how has this evolved over the past few decades?
Well, Tameka, I love this question because I love history, and I feel as a person with a disability, it's important to know our rights and where those rights stem from, how we have come into the rights that we have and the advocacy behind it. And what a lot of people fail to realize is that the civil rights movement was very instrumental in shaping DEI, DEIA practices, and the connection between DEI, disability rights, and even the civil rights. So I'm just going to give just a little bit of some background information about the connection between those three, and then how it has evolved and where we are today, and then the attacks on it. So, of course, we know about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's the landmark civil rights legislation and labor laws that prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. As you see, I did not say disability. I said race, color, religion, sex, national origin. And so while we are members of the disability community, are of various complexions, various religions, and identify in terms of gender one way or another. However, it did not include the protection of people with disabilities to participate and or benefit from programs and activities receiving federal assistance. All right. So the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 that prohibited the discrimination on the basis of disability in programs conducted by federal agencies and receiving the federal financial assistance and federal employment, especially when it came to the federal contractors in the Section 504 of the Rehab Act, which prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities by any program or activity that is federally funded. Now, the reason why I bring up the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, it's because during that time, there was a sit-in protest that took place on April 5th, 1977. It was done in San Francisco because after the passage of 1973, there was a federal building in San Francisco that still did not want to adhere to that passage. And so may she rest in power, Judith Heumann and Ed Roberts, they started this sit-in, but they needed some help. And in order for them to have that help and to maintain their energy and their quality of life and what they need to do to make sure that they make a statement, they had some help. The help came from individuals from the civil rights movement. And these were Black disabled civil rights activists of the 1960s. These individuals were Johnny Lacey and Brad Lomax and Chuck Jackson and Bessie Blount. And so they helped Judith Heumann and they helped Ed Roberts by making sure that they had food and that they had resources while they were continuing their protests. And this is why Judith Heumann always made sure that she paid a lot of respect and homage to Brad Lomax and those individuals, because they were instrumental in helping Judith Heumann and Ed Roberts and several others make sure that San Francisco adhered to the passage of the 1973 of the Rehabilitation Act, because Brad Lomax and Bessie Blount and Chuck Jackson, they were disabled too. And so while they were on the front lines fighting for Civil Rights Act of 1964 and to have, fairness and protections, that movement did not recognize the disability component. So that is where that connection comes in at. That is where one of the foundations, one of the founding elements of our movement and of our advocacy comes from that era, comes from that time. And so that's why I think it's important to recognize that, because when you talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, you cannot talk about it without talking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the sit-in protest of Section 504 in San Francisco, and then talk about DEIA, because they all intersect each other. And that is where our advocacy comes in at, as Black people, as people of color, indigenous, etc., your gender, your race, your religion. That's where all of that comes in at. And as we move now into the current climate, that's what's being attacked. That's exactly what's being attacked. What's being attacked is your religion. What's being attacked is your race. What's being attacked is who you are. What's being attacked is your disability. And let me just briefly talk about disability for a split second, and then I'm going to yield to my colleague here that's on the panel with me today. The reason why they're attacking disability is because they're a bit unintelligent and they're not knowledgeable about disability. For one, let me say this. Disability, everyone is going to have a disability. As you continue to age and get older and you become a senior citizen, then you start to lose certain aspects of certain things that you did not once have, and that becomes a disability. Now, I know someone here in this event are probably saying, yeah, but that's not the same. No, it's not quite the same, but it is also the same. And that's what makes our community so vast and varied, because I'm a person with a physical disability, but mine was caused by a drunk driver that killed my entire family when I was 9. Okay, so while I come to the space as a person with a disability, I come to it from a space of a person with a disability by tragedy. And so I say all that to say that if you're an avid sports player, if you are a person, a woman, or individual who like to walk in heels, and I still do walk in heels from time to time when I want to show off a little bit and I have some energy going on. It can easily happen to anybody. It's not just necessarily developmental or intellectual. Disability is broad. And so what people fail to realize is that they should not lump us into one category, but because they do, that's where the discrimination takes place. And that's where they feel as though, even going back to some of the antiquated mindsets in history, how they put us in institutions and used our bodies as ways for research, because they feel that we were not part of humanity because we're different. But isn't that what society is about? It is a collection of people that come from various backgrounds, different abilities, different cultures. And so that's what we're seeing today. And that is what's taking place. And that's why we have to rally together, be more cohesive, and our power and our work and our knowledge and our skills and abilities to effectively advocate and to combat these challenges. And with that being said, Tameka, I now yield to my colleague that's on the panel.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Monica. I think that was a great summary. So I'm not going to add a ton because I think you pulled out many of the key themes I was going to hit on. I think one, exactly like you said, the civil rights movement and the disability rights movement have been intertwined since the beginning because people have multiple different identities. You are not just your race or your gender or your ability status. You have all of these things. And we move through society with all of those identities that people are reacting to in positive or in negative ways. And the civil rights movement and the disability movement use those same tactics of sit-ins and protests to elevate the discrimination that they were facing and ultimately to win legislative victories, which you were highlighting, to codify in law that you could no longer discriminate on the basis of race, sex, disability, or other protected characteristics. But the reality is that those legislative victories have never been enough to actually end discrimination or achieve true equality. And so, the practice of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility started as a way, one, to help with compliance with those laws, and two, to help try to move us closer to a vision of this country where everyone actually does have equal access to opportunity across sectors. Some of these programs that we now think of as diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility started long before we had that term. They were part of the basic ways that you tried to comply with the law. You had a training in your employment, in your workplace, to make sure that people were aware that they should not discriminate against people, because if you did not have that training, that would increase the risk that if you got sued because of harassment, that you would get found liable. There has been, I think, a growth and expansion in these programs over time, but fundamentally they are part of helping us actually achieve the vision of the Civil Rights Act and the Rehabilitation Act and other core statutes. But what we're seeing now is, I think, a real attempt to bring us back, in time and to erode the progress that we have made on civil rights issues across the board. And so when I am looking at the attacks on diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, I think fundamentally they're attacking our ability to understand the discrimination that's still happening and trying to take away the tools that we have to address it, whether that is through litigation, through any kind of programs that increase equal opportunity, and also attacking even data collection itself.
Exactly. And if you can just briefly share where did DEIA and when did we start using that term? Was it after George Floyd? So after George Floyd, that's when it became more popular, among corporate America. But at what point did we start using those terms?
I've not seen anyone pinpoint the exact moment, but I think you're exactly right, Tameka, that we saw more companies embrace, diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility as a concept, starting with, unfortunately, the murder of George Floyd. There was a moment of reckoning in the country where there was a push for, companies and organizations across the country to do more to ensure racial equity in their own practices. And so that was when we saw companies doing more public statements about their commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, to instituting more programs. That being said, that's a big umbrella. So when companies were embracing diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility, that meant for some, doing some really serious hard thinking about what were the barriers to opportunity in their company. Trying to identify practices that were preventing people from advancing, trying to take a hard look at their hiring practices. And for other companies, it was more symbolic actions, like celebrating, particular holidays or honoring, different communities. And so I think we saw a range of different ways in which companies tried to take up that idea, some of which were more effective at creating actual changes for the people in their workplaces than others.
Exactly. Yeah. But most definitely, that's what I started hearing a lot more, even though I think it was being somewhat used, before George Floyd, but that really brought it to light. And that's what we'll be discussing, later on in the show about the executive orders and, and how those changes are real case scenarios of that. And so,
Tameka, I'm sorry,
yes.
before we continue on, can I just add to that real briefly?
Yes, please.
Okay, and I agree with my colleague on the panel here 100%. I do think that DEI, while it wasn't necessarily stated as DEI, I think around the 80s, DEI was trying to be implemented in the federal government when they were trying to make sure that they hired a certain amount of people from other communities and cultures, especially during the Reagan period because of what was taking place during that time. And so while it wasn't necessarily blatant as DEI, that was what, going back to what my colleague was saying, that is what was taking place in the workforce and in corporate America. And that's when they were really starting to really utilize ERGs, employee resource groups. That is a component of DEI, and talking about the importance of DEI, because ERGs and various ERGs can help shape the policies within the workforce and the policies within corporate America, and really just embracing the commonalities, but also the differences. So I just wanted to add to that as well.
Yeah, that is true. And I know another hot button topic, or before they were, attacking DIA, there was affirmative action. And I know that sure did a lot, particularly I know Black people into college, things like that, and women as well. So that is important. No, and I know they well after affirmative action, first there's a lot of attacks on that. And so with we know that the executive orders and just different things, and then speaking of affirmative action, how have the recent Supreme Court decisions? So, I know they have commented to some of the cases. So how have the recent or even past Supreme Court decisions, such as rolling back affirmative action in particular, influenced the targeting of DEIA initiatives? Kind of leads into what we just discussing.
I'm going to yield to my colleague on this one, as I am not a legal necessarily expert, and so I don't want to misspeak. So I am going to respectfully yield to my colleague here, hoping that she can provide some context to that. And then if whatever she has to say, if I can speak on a little bit more or expound or what have you, I will, but I'm going to yield to her on this particular question if she doesn't mind.
I'm happy to jump in. And so I think folks who have been hearing about conversations on diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility recently have heard a lot of conversation about one specific recent Supreme Court case, which was a case called Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard. That case was actually a challenge to two universities' use of race as a tip in their admissions processes. But not only Harvard, but the University of North Carolina's policies. And I think it's important to know what that decision actually said, before we then talk about how opponents of civil rights have tried to weaponize that decision and apply it to situations that really had nothing to do with that case. So, for those in the audience who are not lawyers, there are a couple of different bodies of law that say when the government or an organization that gets federal funding, like a college, can actually consider race as part of a decision. That's the Equal Protection Clause of the US Constitution, and then part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, known as Title VI. In both of those bodies of law, you can use race in specific circumstances, one of which was to advance a compelling interest in diversity in higher education. And that had been law for decades before this Supreme Court decision in Students for Fair Admissions. And what the court actually decided in Students for Fair Admissions was not that you could no longer rely on diversity as an interest that either the government or a federally funded school could advance through consideration of race, but that the specific programs at Harvard and the University of North Carolina didn't satisfy the very difficult standard that they had to meet in order to actually consider race as part of the process. And so the Supreme Court did not overrule any of its prior cases that said that schools could consider race, but it did make it harder for schools to meet that standard. I think it's also important to know that the Supreme Court didn't do a couple of other things. They didn't overrule any of the law that said that governments could consider race to remedy prior discrimination. They actually reiterated that that was still something that could happen. And they also specifically said that schools could consider how individual students' experience with race affected their lives. So if a student was writing a college admissions essay and said, I grew up as the one Black student in a majority white school, and because of that, I experienced discrimination. I also had to have difficult conversations with my peers. And ultimately, I am a stronger person because of that. Or, I grew up in a community where it was really important that I connected to, the Black church that I was a part of, or I connected to my Filipino grandparents through, different cultural events. All of those conversations about how race impacted individual people could be considered by schools. What was also not a part of the Supreme Court's decision in Students for Fair Admissions was anything to do with what employers can do. So in general, employers are governed by a different part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, known as Title VII. And in Title VII, it had long been true that employers could not consider race as part of a decision about whether to hire someone, promote someone, or change the terms and conditions of their employment, except in an affirmative action program. And affirmative action programs were designed to remedy discrimination and therefore followed that same body of law that the Supreme Court said was still valid in Students for Fair Admissions. But what we have seen, I think, in the aftermath of the Students for Fair Admissions decision is opponents of civil rights doing a couple of things. One, we've seen them try to ignore parts of the Students for Fair Admissions decision itself. For example, the Department of Education has tried to argue that the Students for Fair Admissions decision says that schools can't consider diversity at all under any circumstance. And that's just not true. And also our opponents have tried to apply the Students for Fair Admissions decision to employment and say that it changed what employers can do, even though the Supreme Court didn't decide anything with respect to what employers could do in that case. And finally, they've also tried to argue that the Students for Fair Admissions decision not only dealt as an effect on whether you can consider race explicitly, but also calls into question programs where they may not consider race explicitly, but they're trying to advance equity overall. So a classic example of that would be an employee resource group that might be targeted at meeting the needs of Black employees, creating a space for them to gather, share information, get mentorship, also engage in the networking and just basic navigation of workplaces that we all need in order to actually be able to thrive somewhere. Many employee resource groups like that might be targeted at a specific group, but open to all employees, including allies who are not a member of that particular race. But our opponents have tried to call into question programs that are open to all by arguing that somehow students for fair admissions makes them suspect.
Yeah. Thank you for breaking that all down. I know here in Michigan, where FDIC, where we're from, it was a somewhat, it was a rolling back. I'm trying to remember. I think it was the early 2000s with University of Michigan too, and affirmative action, and it was a whole big thing that came with that. So like I said, the opponents to people who's attacking DEIA also the same people that's attacking affirmative action. So yeah, thank you, Amelia, for breaking that down for us to give us, the myths and the misinformation when it comes to that and sharing the truths. I definitely appreciate that. If anyone have again comments, please, or questions, please put it in the chat. Or if you're watching on Facebook, you're welcome to comment on the video as well, on the post. So, we've seen a wave again of the rollbacks and legal challenges to the DEIA programs nationwide. So my question is, what are some of the key legislative and executive efforts driving these attacks? So like I already stated, that kind of the same people, or that's doing affirmative action doing DEIA. So what are some of the key legislative or executive efforts driving these attacks, particularly on college campuses and workplaces? Monica, if you want to start.
I felt your eyes and your energy just shifting right this direction. No, thank you for the question. I think it's a good question. For one thing, I think what is driving some of these executive orders and some of these very harmful, unjustly inhumane policies that are being implemented, unfortunately, on college campuses, in the workforce and corporate America is I think it is deeply rooted in some of the biases and assumptions that take place. And then I'm just going to mention two particular lifelines for people with disabilities that is being attacked, and then I'm going to yield to my colleague. So what's driving these are the biases that exist within these individuals that are in leadership. I don't want to say in positions of power, okay? Because all of us have power. And it's going to, like I said in the beginning, all of us need to use our collective power to make sure that we combat what I call some of these institutional explicit and individual explicit biases and assumptions that are being used as executive orders and policies that are harmful to humanity or to various cultures and communities that do not reflect what these people in leadership feel that it should. or that they don't feel necessarily comfortable with. And so I just want to mention two biases. One is the institutional explicit. These are policies which explicitly discriminate against a group, race, gender, religion, et cetera, especially as it pertains to voting rights, which I know is something we'll get into a little bit later. And then there's also the individual explicit, and that is prejudice in action. It's blatant discrimination. It's based on, again, person, a populace, or ability. So that would include people with disabilities. And so those biases stems from some of the systemic racism that is unfortunately in the fabric of this country. And so, that is a system of, power, and it's a means to oppress race and ability, and it's used to provide advantages to a certain socioeconomic class while having it be a disadvantage to others. And so this is deeply rooted in what's going on and what we're seeing with a lot of the executive orders and policies. And that also comes from the assumptions that they have about people with disabilities, that they have about communities and cultures that they don't connect with or doesn't reflect what they think the government and the workforce and corporate America should reflect. And so that is what's driving, in my opinion, these are the driving forces that are causing these just wrong, discriminatory, inhumane, bad policies and executive orders. Now, two that come to mind just off the top of my head is we are familiar with or be somewhat familiar with the SAVE Act. This, and I hate the fact that they have called this bad movement policy SAVE Act, because what are you saving? And who are you saving? You're not saving humanity overall. So I hate the fact that is what it's called. But the SAVE Act is one, and then as we are aware, there's the trying to cut the lifeline of individuals that rely on Medicaid and Medicare as a part of their quality of life. And again, it's deeply rooted in these assumptions and these institutional and individual explicit biases and assumptions that come from the systemic racism that has existed in this country for a while, for a very, very long time. And I have to say this part, and then I'm going to yield to my colleague, Tameka, and I'll be quiet because I can run my mouth for days on this. As a Black woman, a Black disabled woman, person with a disability, we have seen systemic racism for what slavery was 400 plus years in this country. And so, the assumptions of Black people have been around for a very long time. The individual institutional biases that were used against us to minimize who we are and to minimize our power, because that's to be if I can just be very transparent and be unprofessional for a second. Let me go unprofessional, then I'll be back to me. Let me just go ahead on and take that professional hat off here. Keep it real 100 here. What they are attacking basically is your power, okay? It is who you are. It is what you look like. That is what they're scared of. It is a scare tactic, right? And we cannot fall into the pits of any type of scare tactic. We are one of the most powerful, strong communities because we know how to navigate and how to be able to pivot in terms of where our disability is to make things happen for ourselves. And because we have that strength, that is what they are attacking. They don't like that. So we need to recognize and see that within ourselves and make sure that we know and make sure that we utilize who we are and the power that we have, and don't use that, let them use that as a scare tactic. We scare them. Don't let them scare us. We scare them, and we shall continue to scare them. Now back to the professional hat. So with that being said, Tameka, these are the elements that are driving these bad policies and executive orders. And with that being said, I hope I didn't scare my colleague. I'm going to now yield to her for her to expound further. Thank you.
I think I'm going to actually pick up on some of your themes and, take us through, the history of how we got here, because I think you hit on the core that these executive actions and legislative actions are really founded in racist, ableist, sexist assumptions about people. When President Trump is talking about meritocracy, it is based on a belief that white men have more merit than other people, and that our systems designed to ensure equality are somehow preventing them from succeeding rather than trying to ensure that everyone has a fair shot. And this goes back to when this all, really started accelerating. So we talked a little bit about how, companies started adopting more public diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs following the murder of George Floyd. At that same time, in the first Trump administration, we saw him issue an executive order that tried to prohibit what he called divisive concepts in the federal government and any trainings provided in the federal government, but also in the conduct of federal contractors and grantees. And when we think of federal contractors and grantees, it's important to know how big of a group that is and how much the president is trying to cover with that kind of an executive order. Federal contractors employ about 20% of the American workforce. And federal grantees are things like every single public school, hospitals that receive federal funding, most colleges and universities that receive funding, a lot of nonprofits that receive funding. So when you're trying to restrict what federal grantees and contractors can do, you're tackling a lot of America. And what that original divisive concepts executive order tried to do was say that you can't talk about systemic racism. You can't talk about implicit bias. These were concepts that suddenly everyone was talking about in that moment. And President Trump tried to say, I'm going to restrict the free speech rights of these federal grantees and contractors through this executive order. And LDF, alongside other partners in the civil rights community like Lambda Legal, sued. And the executive order was then repealed when President Biden took office. But opponents of civil rights took that playbook and started trying to implement similar kinds of efforts at the state level. And that's when we saw state legislation like the Stop Woke Act in Florida or SB 17 in Texas. And these state bills, not only were attacking the teaching of ideas like implicit bias and systemic racism, but also started attacking the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion more broadly. They started prohibiting diversity, equity, inclusion offices and programs, in addition to curriculum and trainings. And so then when President Trump took office again in January 2020, on his first day in office, he started issuing a series of executive orders that further amplified what was being done at the state level and tried to again do it at the federal level. So, through these executive orders, President Trump has really been trying to stretch the bounds of his power as the president and the law itself, ultimately with the goal of advancing this larger agenda of dismantling our civil rights protections, dismantling the federal government's ability to serve the American people, and hoard opportunity for the wealthy 1% in this country. So I think there's been a lot of conversation about different presidential actions, both in this conversation and in the media, but I want to just walk people through two of the executive orders that came down and some of the things that have happened as a result. So those two executive orders are some of his first. An executive order called, quote, Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing from January 20th. And another one called, quote, Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity from January 21st. These executive orders direct federal agencies to do a couple of different things. They direct those agencies to terminate diversity, equity, inclusion offices, positions, and programs in federal government, to terminate DEI, environmental justice, and equity-related grants and contracts, to repeal and actually they repealed themselves, prior executive orders that ensured equal opportunity in the workplace, including a decades-old executive order that required federal contractors to take steps to address barriers to employment. These executive orders direct federal agencies to require federal contractors and grantees to certify that they don't operate any programs that promote DEI, that violates federal anti-discrimination laws. And I think most importantly, all of these executive orders are designed to chill what federal grantees and contractors can do to advance equity, but also there are some specific provisions that threaten civil rights enforcement investigations against publicly traded corporations, nonprofits, foundations that allegedly engage in illegal DEI. You know, we've seen the federal government, as a result of these executive orders, fire employees, some of whom, you know, were not in a diversity, equity, inclusion office. They had other roles. They were doing other things to help the American people, but they have nevertheless unfairly lost their jobs. We've seen the federal government terminate a wide variety of different grants and programs, from research into Black maternal health to, you know, dementia and other medical issues, to, you know, terminating funding for nonprofits to investigate housing discrimination, and really threatening our ability to ensure that people have equal access to housing, to threatening, you know, programs that create workforce training and, you know, healthcare, a wide variety of other services. And I think, you know, to me, what is notable about the breadth of what we're seeing come as a result of these attacks is that it really puts a point on what the administration is aiming at in these executive actions. You know, this is not about ending a workplace training policy. This is about ending our tools for ensuring equality in this country, wherever we see that across sectors. And so I think it's really important for everyone to understand the stakes of what we're fighting for.
Exactly. Yes, thank you for breaking that again, that down for us, because even just in, you know, the field that, you know, I'm in the space of racial equity, racial justice, disability justice and stuff, you know, it's been feeling constantly under attack. And, you know, just one example of that is, you know, through social media. And so, you know, think about a month ago, there was, you know, or it's like Fox 2 News is one of those, you know, Fox 2 News Facebook posts here talk about DEI and things like that. And then my friend, you know, who has a disability would say, you know, how this also affects people, you know, with disabilities. And, you know, because these DEIA programs give him ability to be more in the workplace. And, you know, he's a white, you know, male who uses a wheelchair. And so people commented and said, well, you're just not qualified. You just can't do the job. And I'm like, you know, so then I had to chime in and stuff like and I tried to explain it, which I know I shouldn't get into these Facebook battles because you're always going to lose. But, you know, I try to explain the facts and blot it out, and, you know, but people just going to believe whatever, you know, they want to believe. But, you know, that's in people's ideas and their heads. It's just not, you know, you're not qualified, you're not good enough because you have a disability or whatever, you know, and things like that. So it really affects us. And it's scary to see, you know, that there's people that think like this. And then some of them, you know, unfortunately is in, you know, in nonprofits and other areas of business. So as we speaking, you know, about people with disabilities and, you know, race and those type of things, we know, particularly in the disability community, you know, we are very intersectional. So we're in, all different types of identity groups. So my next question is, how are people with disabilities, especially those from multi-marginalized backgrounds, uniquely impacted by dismantling of these DEIA initiatives?
Great question, Tameka. I will answer, and then I'll yield to my co-panelists here with me. And I agree with Tameka. Thank you for breaking that down of the executive orders. That was truly great. I think how it is, if I'm understanding your question correctly, how is it impacting their voice and impacting who they are mentally and emotionally? I think that's kind of the direction that you were going with this question. And then I think the reason it's impacting them immensely, especially in the workforce, because especially if they were federal employees and or they still federal employees, luckily they still have their job, their title, if you will, but not necessarily their job. And I'm gonna say that real quickly. What I mean by that is that they are there by title, but the delegated responsibilities of their job may have been minimized even more because of the executive orders and the way that they are operating now in the federal government, which leads to your question that there aren't any ERGs. ERGs would be considered another way of diversity celebrations, diversity, equity, inclusion. And that is such a bad word now in the federal government, and even somewhat just nationally in other spaces, which is very unfortunate. And so when a person's voice is minimized, when a community and culture's voice is then minimized, it impacts their mental health. And I want to say for those that disability may be mental illness, I know mental health and mental illness are two different types of disabilities, right? Mental illness is genetic, and it was that is what you was, I don't like the word diagnosed, but that is what they said. Mental illness versus mental health is when there are breakdowns of times of your thoughts, and you're feeling like your self-worth is not worthy anymore, right? And so I say that all of us now are struggling with some mental health issues, even include myself. Yes, I still have my job here at NDRN. Yes, in my unofficial capacity, yes, I still do DEI training and voter engagement. But because they are attacking our community, my community that I love and value, because I call us foot soldiers in the disability army. That's what we are. We are an army of disability advocates that is vast and varied, that we're protecting our rights so that we can continue to embrace and support disability justice, which is who we are and who we identify as within disability justice, and having those rights to be protected. But those rights seem like they are being stripped by the second. And that appears as what's happening. And so with that being said, I think, and not to infringe religion on anyone, but when I think about our mental health and the well-being of our mental health, I now more than ever, because I'm still a little bit of a part-time heathen, I still listen to some nice good hip hop, and still like to go to a couple of lounges that it's the opposite of the sanctuary, if you will. And so I find myself now, whatever it is that is helpful for me to make sure that I continue to protect my mind, because my mind is needed for my community, to protect my mind and my overall mental well-being. I find myself delving into that word even more. I grew up in a Baptist church. I am a Christian. And so when in doubt, when things are happening around you, and when you're not understanding what's taking place, because I have been not just conditioned, but also just deeply rooted in biblical principles, I go back to that word. And I make sure that that word is constantly at the center of everything that I am doing so that I can be the best version for myself, as well as an employee at NDRN, but then also as an individual that is continuing to fight for our rights in my unofficial capacity, which is where I become a little bit of a Fannie Lou Hamer, which happens to be, you know, my favorite icon and voting rights individual. And so that's what I think is going on. I feel like they feel that individuals don't have that space anymore in corporate America, in the workforce, to have the ERGs. Part of the ERGs was to be able to connect with and just have that space to talk with individuals that are like-minded, that come from that same shared experiences and backgrounds, and talk about what needs to be done to make just the environment just a better place, a more inclusive and welcoming place. Now we're not seeing the word inclusive. Inclusive is another word that's considered bad or harmful. And so that's, you know, that's what I think is going on, Tameka. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I would love to kind of delve into that a little bit more as it pertains to voting rights and the mental health capacity, because I think that it's critically important, especially as we go into, the midterm elections in 2026, but also some elections that are taking place this year, and how it's important to protect our mental health, what that looks like, and how that will impact us as voters, and what we need to do to make sure we exercise our voice at the voting ballot to restore the beauty and the inclusivity of America. And so with that said, I yield to my colleague there.
And I'll just add two additional specific examples to what Monica was talking about from what we're seeing happening at the federal level. I think one is this weaponization of prejudice and bias to turn different communities against each other. I think and ultimately the goal of that is to have us feel like we need to fight each other rather than trying to attack the efforts to strip away our rights as collectively. I think one of the things that was, so striking in the early weeks of the administration was another executive order they didn't talk about following the plane crash at Nashville Airport, in which there was this false allegation from the president that somehow someone involved in that crash was a person with a disability. And there was truly abhorrent rhetoric in the executive order itself, questioning the ability of people with disabilities to serve within federal government, to serve within the Federal Aviation Administration, as well as attacking people on the basis of race who were serving in the same agency. There was a fundamental misunderstanding about what it means to provide accommodations for people with disabilities in employment, and how people with disabilities can access and serve competently, extraordinarily in a wide variety of roles with accommodations. I think with that goal of trying to get people to feel like diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility efforts somehow impact their safety, and therefore they should be on board with this idea that we roll them back. So I think that's one, theme and trend that unfortunately we're seeing is, the continued targeting of different groups and claiming that they don't deserve to be in particular jobs and other positions. I think there's also been some specific actions by the federal government to actually roll back guidance and other documents that were intended to ensure equal access for people with disabilities. One that comes to mind is that the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission had issued guidance about the kinds of technology that employers could use when hiring. And, we're trying to advise employers about what they had to do to make sure that those new technologies didn't discriminate against people with disabilities. Because, if they're assessing, particular movement patterns that might not be equally available to everybody, if they are assessing other kinds of characteristics there might be people, and there are people who are fully qualified to perform a job, but might not perform well on a specific kind of employment test administered through these new technological tools. And one of the first things that happened after, the now acting chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission assumed that role is she pulled that guidance. So that is no longer there to help employers know how they can comply with their anti-discrimination obligations as with respect to people with disabilities.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, about the reminder about the plane crash, because yeah, that was outrage. And it was just so sad to see, with disability groups, speaking out against it. And then some people just repeating what the press said and attacking, disabled people and the leaders on their own page. Like, yeah, you should be. I'm like, oh my God. It's just, it was horrendous. So, to definitely, are being attacked. And with the DEIA, it has spilled over, which, is a whole new other webinar. But when it comes to the 504, protections has been, under attack, and, other pieces of, disability legislation. I know there has been issues when it comes to the African American Museum, and that's under attack. So it can affect our mental health when you're constantly being felt like your identity and your history don't matter, or when they want to take that away. So thank you for mentioning that. So we're gonna go for another about 30, little bit under 30 minutes. So again, if you have any comments or questions, please put it in the chat. Um, so my question to you, Amelia, is from a legal standpoint. How is, and I think you spoke a little bit of it earlier, but how is the Equal Protection Initiative and the Legal Defense Fund responding to these challenges? And what are the specific legal strategies being employed to safeguard inclusive programs?
Yeah, so, like I talked about at the top, we employ all of the tools that are toolkit at LDF to try to combat these strategies. So I'd put what we're doing in a couple of big buckets: educate, advocate, and litigate. So the educate part is, trying to make sure that all of the different organizations that the Trump administration is trying to chill right now and try to get to voluntarily roll back their diversity, equity, inclusion programs know what the law actually is and what the president can and cannot do to change the law. So, when I talked about those executive orders earlier, the president, has some ability to dictate federal policy, but he can't actually change what our civil rights laws say. And there are many cases that have found that diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility programs are lawful, and in fact, as help advance compliance with these core rights, with our anti-discrimination protections, and with our vision for equality in this country. And the president can't change that with a Sharpie. And so we've been talking to business groups, to parents and students, to nonprofits, to make sure that people know the limits of what the president can change through these executive actions and what they can still do lawfully to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility. Because ultimately the courts have the deciding voice in what the law says, and the president can't change that. The other thing we've been doing is a lot of advocacy. So, sending letters to the administration pointing out what they are misstating about the law, and also educating and advocating with other entities. So, for example, the Department of Education tried to implement these anti-equity executive orders by telling all state education agencies that they had to certify that they were complying with the Trump administration's view of what they can do to advance diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And so we organized a letter along with 60 other civil rights and education organizations to send to the administration saying, like, this is what you're getting wrong about the law. And then organized webinars to educate schools about what the law actually says, and then sent letters to state education agencies encouraging them to not preemptively comply with an attempt to rewrite what they can do to help their own students and school communities. And that then brings me to that last bucket of litigation. Because in addition to all of those advocacy tools, we also filed suit. And we challenged both those actions by the Department of Education and won a preliminary injunction last week against this attempt to get state education agencies to certify compliance with this misreading of civil rights law. And we've also filed a lawsuit alongside Lambda Legal to challenge the other anti-equity executive orders that I talked about earlier, as well as a third executive order that seeks to erase the existence of transgender people and deny them their dignity in federal programs and through their interactions with federal contractors and grantees. That second case, we are still waiting on a decision, but we have also asked the court in that case to stop the Trump administration from implementing these executive orders against our clients, the National Urban League, the National Fair Housing Alliance, and the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. So I think we're going to continue to educate, advocate, and litigate to push back against these attacks, and keep fighting.
Yes, and real briefly, if you could just share, Amelia, what is the limitations? That is one of the things that I have, shared, among people, is that he hasn't stopped the Civil Rights Act, or the 68 Fair Housing and things like that. So if you could just real briefly go over, the limitations with the executive orders.
So I think there are a couple of things. One, like I talked about, the executive orders are trying to chill the free speech of federal grantees and contractors, of employers, nonprofit schools, all of us in this country. They're trying to make us feel like we cannot advocate for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And that is a violation of the First Amendment. The president cannot do that. And so one of the legal challenges that we've raised is saying that these executive orders are discriminating based on the viewpoint of those of us who believe in equity, who believe in diversity and inclusion and accessibility. So we're challenging that aspect. But I think to the heart of your question, Tameka, what the president can do is, the president can say, like, okay, so I might choose not to fund a particular program anymore, but only within limits. So Congress has independent power to fund things. And so the president can't interfere with Congress's decision to fund programs or not fund programs. He can't interfere with the implementation of federal statutes. So that's one thing. The president also can't administer funding, so he can't decide who to give money to in a discriminatory way. So you can't decide, I'm not going to fund your organization because you engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think We've challenged these executive orders based on the idea that that's exactly what the president is trying to do, that he's trying to not just control what the federal government itself is saying and doing, but trying to prevent organizations across the board from advocating for diversity, equity, inclusion. And also the president can't actually rewrite the federal civil rights laws themselves or change how courts interpret them. That is the court's duty. And the Supreme Court actually reaffirmed last year that the courts have to independently interpret the statutes that Congress passes. And that is something that is their job as the courts. And federal agencies might say, this is how we want you to interpret it, but the courts interpret the law, Congress writes the law, and the president has limited powers to interfere in that.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
Don't we just love a bicameral type of government where, one, we cannot have a dictator, that, we have Congress who writes it, Supreme Court who interprets it, and then the executive office is supposed to enforce it. And so although I'm sure, there's a particular branch of government that doesn't want to enforce what the Supreme Court has interpreted, it is good to make sure that there is equal. That's what you consider equality. When you say that, Amelia, that is what you consider equality right there, where everything is looked at equally and interpreted the way that it's supposed to. So I have to add to that.
Yes. So thank you for that, Amelia. I know that's a lot of questions. I'm hoping that our audience, I know that they have a greater understanding. That's the purpose of this webinar. So Monica, as a voter engagement strategist and DEI trainer, how does the civic engagement intersect with the fight to protect and advance DEI efforts, and what should voters be paying attention to, especially it goes back to what you say with mental health. So how can we as community better do that?
Tameka, thank you for that question. I think what our community, people with disabilities, voters that are disabled, recognize that you do have a right to vote. Okay, you have the right to vote. Anyone that tells you that you do not have the right to vote, no, you have the right to vote even if you have guardianship, which I'm going to get into in just a minute. I think what is even more critically important is recognizing that what is happening on the federal level, that while we continue to use our influence, our power, our knowledge, our ability to combat these harmful, inhumane policies and laws that they're trying to enforce, really also kind of shift just a little bit onto the local level, because the local level is where the rubber meets the road. Those are the laws that affect your day-to-day life. And so sometimes you got to go back to the drawing board. I know that we shouldn't necessarily have to a certain extent, but given the current environment that we're in, we need to now make sure that our folks are fully knowledgeable, equipped with everything that they need as a voter, because that's what it goes back to: knowing your rights, knowing your abilities, and knowing what needs to happen to make sure that everyone is a part of the electoral process. And so that's how we continue to increase and build our civic engagement. And what I want to pretty much talk about is some of the state and federal laws regarding voting, as well as the mental capacity piece. And I won't try to take up too much time because I know we are up against time here. So I'll try to be very brief, Tameka, although I wish you would have asked this question in the beginning. So I apologize, but I just want to go over a couple of the state voting laws and some federal voting laws. And also say this too before I go into that. You don't necessarily have to be connected. You should be connected to some national organizations and organizations that are doing this work, because they need our voices at the table so they can continue to recognize that we are a part of the broader community, but then also making sure that you develop to your own, type of network and community, because where these national organizations may not necessarily be able to reach people in certain areas or certain communities that you can. And so also building your own network and building your own coalition within the broader coalition is definitely going to be needed and critical at this time, if that makes any sense. But let me just go over a few of some state and federal laws that we need to know to make sure that we are equipped as we enter into some of the elections that are taking place on the local level, municipal elections. Some states have a statewide election, such as New Jersey and Virginia, although I know this is Michigan, but I believe, if I'm not mistaken, maybe there were certain parts of Michigan that may have had a few local elections. I'm not quite necessarily sure about that.
Yeah,
but I know we are, okay, that's what I thought. But I know we're also getting prepared for midterm elections. And so it's very important that we know our rights and make sure that everyone is doing everything they can to have access to the voter ballot. And so some of the state voting laws, I just want to go over briefly. Every state has the power and legal authority to regulate voter qualifications based on an individual's, especially their mental capacity. But most states, unfortunately, do have some type of mental health measures that determines their rights to vote, but it can vary from state to state. So what I would recommend that individuals do is definitely know some of the voting rights laws that you have, that Congress has passed over the years pertaining to voting rights for people with disabilities, and making sure that legislation is definitely implemented on the local level. And that is the Voting Rights Act, of course, the VRA. We all are familiar with the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Help America's Vote Act, HAVA, which is very, very important. We briefly went over the Rehabilitation Act. Then, of course, the National Voter Registration Act. And so while we have these laws that primarily focus on voting rights for those with disabilities, particularly physical disabilities, sometimes some of them don't necessarily apply to the mental disability or what some states use, which I despise this word, is diminished capacity. And so each law addresses those specific issues pertaining to that. The VRA does abolish using literacy tests as a way to limit who may or may not be able to vote. That's why I say it's important to know your rights as a voter, because that's very important. The ADA does forbid people from or individuals or election officers or what have you. The ADA forbids preventing qualified people from voting. It forbids that if they meet the essential requirements to vote. And then the HAVA Act allows individuals whose eligibility to vote is questioned. It grants that voter, especially a voter with mental health, the ability to vote using a provisional ballot. These types of laws are important. We need to make sure that we are talking to every vote, even if we feel like they know it. You still never know. We have to keep constantly just speaking it over and over and over again, and break it down in simple terms, such as this. Such as just the basic, definition of what I just mentioned pertaining to these laws that are here in regards to us voting, and especially those in terms of the mental capacity. So I, pretty much say all that to say that what we need to do is just make sure that we are participating in everything pertaining to voting rights, making sure that our voices are even in spaces and places and tables that typically don't talk about people with disabilities, but they need to. Because again, although we have a disability and although the mainstream issues impacts the broader impact and impacts us even greater. And on top of that, it has a snowball effect on our quality of life. Our voices are needed at that table. But then also, aside from our voices being needed at that table, again, we too can form our own types of groups and coalitions to make sure that we are educating our people, especially because I come from the spinal cord injury community. And so there is over 100 and something or 200 some thousand individuals that have some type of spinal cord injury each year. And so they are now a part of the community, whereas they probably didn't pay attention to these voting laws pertaining to them as a voter because they weren't a part of the disability community. They are now. So it is very, very, very important that we continue to educate, empower, and enforce the laws, the voting laws, and the voting rights we have as individuals that do this work, especially someone like me who's constantly hitting the pavement pertaining to voting rights. And that's, I hope I answered your question. There was some more information on voting and mental health, and then just voting for people with disabilities, but I know we're out of time. So I just want to hone in on definitely those specific voting right laws and making it plain and simple so that everyone understands that and recognizes that they have their right to cast their voice at the voter ballot.
Yes, thank you, thank you. And so, as we're winding down, the question for you, Monica, this on last question, and then afterwards, please tell us how we can find you, and then I'll go back to you, Amelia. So, Monica, you gave us a really great breakdown, first with the voting. So, as from your perspective, what can we do as disability advocates, people who work in, nonprofit sector and such? What can we do to fight back against these policies? What is your recommendation, especially, now, but then well into the future? Because I believe in humanity, and we're going to get past this. So, but what is your recommendations?
So I have a couple of recommendations. One is amplify your voice at the local level. You are the policy. You as an individual are the law. And if you see an area within the law, or even a new law that needs to be created to make sure that it includes people with disabilities, that it protects the rights of voters with disabilities and voting rights, make sure that you speak up. You speak up, you show up, and you show out. Because you may get 9 no's, but there's going to be a 1 yes. And you take that 1 yes, believe in yourself that you can make that impact and that difference. And you make sure that you connect with these elected officials, with candidates, with incumbents, with grassroots leaders to make things happen. And these laws, even the systemic racism that is deeply rooted in the fabric of our country, it's because they believed in their power and their ability to have these types of systemic, laws and systems that are in place. Well, again, we have that same right and power and ability, that we believe in our quality of life, that we believe in fairness, that we believe in inclusivity, that we believe in all of humanity. And so don't just sit back and feel like, oh, I have nothing to contribute. I don't have anything that I can do. I'm not a policymaker. You are a policymaker. So shift your narrative of what you think about yourself and what you think about our community and even the current environment. And recognize that because you are a policymaker, it may take you to truly be that policymaker, that the policymaker that's sitting in that position needs you to be even better advocates. So recognize some of the loopholes and the gaps within what's happening with our community and fill in that gap. That's one. And then secondly, don't be afraid to have relationships with individuals outside of our community. Outside of, we get so comfortable with normalcy in the sense that, they're not going to understand us, or, we're not going to have anything in common. There's more in common than there's not in common. And everybody doesn't think that way. And so in order for us, for our collective voice to be stronger and to be even more powerful and empowering, is that we also have to make sure that we show up in spaces that typically don't see people with disabilities, or furthermore, let me restate, or people that have non-visible disabilities but aren't strong disability advocates, because sometimes it may take you to be that person that's upfront, bold, powerful, and is comfortable and confident in their disability, for those that are in those spaces to say, you know what? If she can do it, I can do it too. And then we can continue to then, at that point, really put a spotlight on the beauty and the importance of having a diverse voice. So always make sure that your network consists of people that are not disabled, or people that have different types of disabilities, so that we can too continue to look at one another and appreciate one another's various abilities and various voices. And so that's pretty much what I think would be helpful for us. And with that, I yield back to you, Tameka.
And where can people find you as well? Where can people find you?
They sure they want to find me?
A little more information.
They can definitely find me if they want me to, in my official capacity at the National Disability Rights Network, then they can find me. I'll put my information in the chat here via email, which is monica.wiley@ndrn.org. And then in my unofficial capacity, if you want me to be more of a preacher and be a little bit more of a rah-rah revolutionist, I will put my personal email address in the chat as well. And so I hope that I was impactful and that I left you, the attendees here, with something to think about and some knowledge. And Amelia, it was a pleasure serving with you. I really do hope that we can stay connected. I hope you found something in my presentation information that was valuable, that you feel that can also be helpful in the work that you do from the legal standpoint. So thank you.
Definitely, Monica, it's been a pleasure. Tameka, I don't know if you're going to pose the same question to me or a different.
Yeah, the same question. But before I get to that, we have in the chat the survey, so please fill out our survey. Let us know, what are your thoughts about today? Any recommendations? Also, we have upcoming trainings here at MDRC and within our programs. So there is an Eventbrite link in the chat, and also for those who's watching us, follow us, continue to follow us on our Facebook page, LinkedIn, and our website to learn of upcoming events and leadership cohorts that is about to take place, because we all edify, lead in, and lead have upcoming cohorts for the community. So with that being said, yes, Amelia, if you can share us what one or two things the community can do to fight back against these harmful policies, and where people can reach you at.
Yeah. So I completely agree with Monica's suggestion that, people can exercise their power in advocacy. And I would expand that even beyond, talking to your government officials, whether the federal, state, and local level, because, like we've been talking about today, all of our institutions are under pressure. All of them are feeling this chill. And there are ways that we can raise up our voices to provide a counterweight. So I would advocate for people to talk to their schools, the schools where their children are going, and say, these are the programs that I value that make my child thrive and that I want to see continue. And you should not roll back, this diversity, equity, inclusion, or accessibility program because it's important to me. And I'm a part of your school community. I think we can be doing the same with our employers. They're under this pressure right now from the federal government, from, anti-civil rights groups. And we can and should be saying to them as employees, like, look, I'm a valuable contribution to your company. You want to keep me and you want to hire other talented people. This is what you need to do to make sure that that's possible, to make sure that I can thrive. And I think being the voice, not just in government, but also in the institutions that we're all a part of, to say why these programs are valuable and that we want them to continue, is another strategy that we can be using in this moment. My email address is asmirniotopoulos@naacp.ldf.org. And just thank you so much for letting me be a part of this.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you again, both of you, for joining me in this important conversation, and thank you for everyone here in the Zoom, and also who's watching us via on Facebook. That hopefully, I know that you have taken away important information, and so we're not powerless. We definitely can and will continue for what we need in our community. So hope everyone have a great rest of your day and see you next time.
Bye.
The recording has stopped.